The essence of off-roading is freedom and self-reliance. The freedom to travel off the maintained roads and the self-reliance to survive there without help or any services. If you off-road, everybody is eventually going to break on the trail and need to do some type of repair to get home. It's going to happen to everybody eventually. If you off-road a lot, you're going to do a lot of trail repairs in your lifetime. And depending on what breaks, a trail repair can be anything from a fun learning experience to a complete nightmare. And trust me, I've had a lot of complete nightmares on trail runs. Carrying spare parts isn't enough though, because installing those spare parts often requires specialized tools to install them. So you need an intelligent trail repair package that includes all the tools you'll need to install all the parts that you brought. In this video, I'll show you what tools and parts I pack for off-road trips and why I do it. After watching this video, I recommend that you learn to do all the repairs that I discuss in this video. The variety of spare parts and tools that I bring on an off-road trip greatly depends on the location and the duration of that trip. I basically pack for 3 different 4x4 scenarios: local day trips, multi-day off-road trips, and multi-day trailered trips. A local day trip is the common Jeep club run or day run where you leave home in the morning and, basically come back home that same day. Services and help, aren't that far away. And if you have an issue, it really isn't that big of a deal to get help. And often on those short duration trails like that, a broken rig can just simply limp out with the brake without getting a repair on the trail. But a multi-day remote trip is when you run a remote trail that takes more than 1 day to run and is pretty far away from services and help. This is trails like the Doozy, Swamp Lake, the Rubicon, where self-sufficiency is a must. These are the type of trails to where if you break down on the trail and you don't have a spare, you're not getting towed out of that trail. You're basically abandoning your rig there until you can get the right parts and tools in to recover it. Then we have a multi-day trailer trip. And this is when you trailer your 4x4 to an off-road park or to places like Johnson Valley, Sand Hollow, or a Moab. And then you do basically day runs on trails from camp or from a hotel room. Most tools and parts on these trips are kept in your towed rig, which isn't too far away. On local day trips, I tend to go minimalist with parts and tools on, a simple day run. I have the option of running home or to the store or back to the trailer if I need to get parts. So I usually don't carry too much on a simple day trip. These trails are usually short enough to limp a broken rig out to, usually. But if you need to run for parts, it's really not a big deal. I can easily walk off these trails on foot and back to civilization if I need to, and get a trailer to the trailhead pretty fast if I just need to get it out and on a trailer. I usually don't take things like drive lines, axle shafts, and spare engine parts on these runs. I really don't even take a spare tire on these runs. So I'm going to show you a typical day trip tool and spare parts kit that I carry in my wife's TJ. So this is my wife's tool and parts bag that she carries in her TJ when she goes out wheeling. And I have one similar to this in my Jeep. And then I have a little ammo can about this size in my buggy. So let's take a look at what we take on our day and local trips here. Of course, gloves, some JB Weld, a rag, spare serpentine belt. Please take this on the trail. A spare crank positioning sensor. Yeah, if you own a 4.0 Jeep, you better have one of these handy. a spare throttle positioning sensor for her TJ, a 36 millimeter. Without this 36 millimeter socket, you are not going to remove your axle shafts on the trail. A set of 1/2 inch sockets from 1/2 inch all the way up to big size there to 1 inch. Then the Ultimate Trail Tools crescent wrenches. I carry a couple of big ones. This really huge one is capable of tightening up jam nuts on 1¼ inch heims. And 2 of these, one of them isn't going to do you a lot of good because you usually have the bolt and the nut, and you have to do them both. So a smaller wrench set, a funnel, some tire repair kit with some spare valve stems and valve cores in it, some hose clamps, spare bolts, and this has a spare bolt for everything. Upper control arms, lower control arms, steering components, shocks, everything in there. Even spare beadlock bolts, a spare castle nut for rod ends. It's got everything in there. Another handy trail tool, pair of channel locks, pair of cutters, electrical tape, little handy dandy sets of Allen and Torx wrenches. Got an interesting combination of those on every Jeep. Some big and small flat and Phillips head screwdrivers. Another handy trail tool, vice grips. You can do anything with this. You can fix a broken brake line. Lots of uses. Some pliers. Some wire strippers and crimpers. But I have a ton of different size zip ties in here. Always come in handy. Oh, you're going to like this one. A little extendable magnet here so I can flush broken pieces of axle shaft out of axle tubes. And a spare front extended brake line for her TJ. The front of her TJ has that weird square banjo fitting on it, so that's a trail spare for that. And that's pretty much, oh, hold on a sec. And a 1/2 inch wrench with, of course, the socket to do her lug nuts on there. And that's basically the spare tools and parts we carry for just a quick local run. And next we have multi-day remote trips, and most overlanding that you see in Australia or Africa or Canada and Alaska would probably fall into this category. Packing tools and parts for multi-day remote trips is pretty difficult, to tell you the truth. You need to strike a balance between taking too much stuff and having what you might absolutely need. You need to consider 2 things. Number 1, what breaks a lot or frequently in my type of full-wheel drive? And number 2, what kind of brakes will 100% strand me on the trail if it happens? For a trail like the Rubicon, I packed this in my wife's TJ. Now let me show you all the spare parts we bring for a multi-day remote trip. And this is the parts bin for Becca's TJ, and I have the same size action packer for my JK as well. And the dimensions of these aren't very big. I think it's a reasonable size to hold every spare part I'm probably going to need or might need, or something that would strand me for a long duration trail run. So let's crack this open and take a look inside. Right off the top, front brake line, rear brake line, duct tape, RTV blue and black. Need to seal up a diff, make a gasket. Here's one you don't think of very often. A high pressure or pressure side power steering hose. You lose this on the trail, you're fucked. I mean, you're not going to put it back together with hose clamps because, in all likelihood, the pump on your Jeep is probably putting out 1400 PSI, and, a little rubber hose with the hose clamp is not going to hold that. It's going to keep blowing. So this little high pressure power steering line, seen a lot of people go down and have to leave rigs out because of that, but not us. Crank position sensor, as usual. You drive a 4.0 Jeep, better have one. Some hose clamps, plug wires. Here's a good one right here. Spare upper and lower radiator hoses. How about that? Spare heater hose. Don't see that on the trail too often. Spare piece of vacuum line. Spare belts. And this is more spare bolts. Everything on the TJ basically. Control arms, upper and lower control arms, shock mounts, track bar, drag links, steering components, castle nut for the rod ends, everything in here. Even bolts for her bead locks. 1310 U-bolt kit for her U-joints. Wheel bearings. Spare radiator cap. If that goes, you're in trouble. A spare map sensor. A spare idle air control valve. A spare throttle positioning sensor. Spare fuses and spare relays, including a spare starter relay. Spare U-joints for the axle and for the drive lines. Spare set of spark plugs. A bunch of zip ties. A spare thermostat. And a thermostat housing gasket. A spare alternator. Who carries this? But you know what? This has saved Becca and my ass before, carrying a spare alternator. Also, along those same lines, a spare water pump. You lose your water pump on the trail, you're fucked. And a gasket for it. A Dana 44 1310 pinion, and this will fit either side, front or rear axle on Becca's Jeep. A spare pitman arm. That's right. How many of these have you seen break on the trails while we're rock crawling? A spare pitman arm and a spare pitman arm nut because, as you know, a lot of times to get these off, you got to break out the old die grinder and cut the old nut off. So that's on there. And a pitman arm puller. Yep. Spare set of upper and lower ball joints for either side. So got an upper and a lower ball joint too. What happens is a lot of the times, especially snow wheeling or in the sand or even sometimes on the rocks, but you get a whole bunch of speed and then it grabs and then let goes. And a lot of times what that happens is you break the U-joint, bend the ears out, everything flops around in there, and you end up blowing out a ball joint too. Seen that countless times. Had to run back into town, go through part stores trying to find ball joints. Well, she has a set. Spare bushings for front panhard bar. So this has really come in handy. I've lost these before. A set of, well, just take my word for it. Every electrical connector you can imagine is in this. And on top of that, I have electrical tape and spare electrical wire. And to round this all out, a complete set of wheel studs. Man, I know it's hard to believe, but I've done it on my Jeep a couple of times. Becca's done it once in Johnson Valley, and I've seen countless other people do it, where you're wheeling hard in the rocks and you shear off, sometimes a couple, sometimes all of your wheel studs on the trail. And if you don't have spare studs, you're fucked in. These are always hard to find. No parts store ever has them in stock. So carrying these in advance is a lifesaver. And that's basically it. It's empty. That's basically all the spare parts that will fix a critical breakdown and keep me going and keep Becca going on the trail. And I could fit all of this in this little action packer that doesn't take up a lot of room in the Jeep. On these types of trips, I also take a welder with me. Also, a spare tire is a great idea on these types of runs. Luckily, my wife and I run the exact same lug patterns on our Jeeps, so we can both share one spare. And I also take spare fluids with me. Back in the day, I used to carry a big tub full of fluids, but I don't do that anymore. Of course, carry some antifreeze with me, but I really like carrying all of my fluids in a 5-gallon bucket because I can use this 5-gallon bucket for a lot of different things. If I need to drain my rear diff, to get in there to do some stuff, I can drain all my diff fluid into this bucket and reuse that fluid. Also, this bucket, if I need to run down to a creek or something and bring back some water, the bucket works for that. And lastly, I can line this bucket with a trash bag, and I can poop in here if I need to. Makeshift bathroom. But of course, I always bring brake fluid with me. Brake line problems are very common on the trail. Power steering fluid. Motor oil, choose your brand of motor oil, but always bring some motor oil with you. Gear oil, man. Bring plenty of gear oil. If you don't need it, somebody else in your group is going to need it. Transmission fluid. I guess in a pinch, you could carry nothing but transmission fluid, and you can use it in a pinch as power steering fluid. I don't really like to do that. I don't want to lose the seals on my expensive pump and ram, but a lot of people do that. JB weld, that's the plastic weld right there. If you ever break the top of a plastic radiator, the plastic part on the top of one of the modern radiators, or maybe one of the newer plastic fuel tanks or something, that plastic weld comes in very handy. And of course, the old steel stick right there. I've repaired a lot of stuff over the years on the trail with that puppy. Stuff really comes in handy. And of course, your classic Mega Black right there. You always have to seal the diff back up after you take it apart. And of course, some hand cleaner. Definite must on the trail. So that's the type of fluids I carry. I don't go overboard. In addition to those spare parts on a multi-day remote trip, that's when I start thinking about carrying spare axle shafts. And these are spare shafts for the front of Becca's TJ for her Dana 44. And that's when I bring some power tools with me, man. When you're out in the middle of nowhere doing a lot of repairs, man, the old Ugga Dugga sure saves some time. So always bring that. And I always bring my portable die grinder with me too. This comes in handy if I need to cut some metal or cut a hose clean or redo a reusable fitting on hydro assist or full hydro steering. And it also helps me clean up metal parts to weld on them. So this die grinder comes in really handy too. And of course, a full set of impact sockets for that too, and spare battery charger. And that's pretty much the gear I carry on a remote trip. And you can see it's quite a lot of gear, but we wheel in some really tough trails and remote places, and I always get out. And I think the preparation I do is why. On a multi-day trailer trip, I usually take more spare parts and tools than any other type of trip because I can carry all that stuff in my tow rig. People usually take more chances and run harder trails on these types of trips too, because the safety of a trailer is never far away. So people take more chances on these types of trips. Most of my multi-day trailer trips are actually in my rock buggy that you see behind me. And there's nothing better than spending a week in Johnson Valley or Sand Hollow with your buddies. But we break a lot of things in those places, and I bring a lot of stuff for repairs. Now I'm going to show you what I bring on multi-day trailer trips with me. In addition to every spare part and tool you can possibly imagine, I also bring a welder, jack stands, lots of fluids, and a full complement of power tools. And on remote trailer trips, this is pretty much what I bring. That bin is all axles, drive lines, tires, wheels, and shocks, engine and electrical components, steering and hydraulics. See, I always take a spare ORI strut with me, spare trep right there. And in addition to this, I'll have my welder, jack stands, and a nitrogen bottle in the truck too. Back in the day, we all carried a high lift jack. I mean, everybody did. But in retrospect, that was actually pretty dumb. High lift jacks are heavy, cumbersome, and in reality, they don't do a really good job of lifting tires off the ground. And these are literally the most dangerous tool you can ever use on the trail. I suspect that people who carry these days just don't really know any better. When we went away from, using leaf springs on 4x4s and started building rigs with lots of flex and down travel, we discovered that high lift jacks really didn't work anymore. These 60-inch high lift jacks won't even lift a tire off the ground on any of our rigs. Our Gladiator, TJ, JK, and my rock buggy, these big high lift jacks will not lift a tire off the ground. They're not even capable of doing that. Sure, people will argue you could use a high lift jack as a winch, Desert Dog, but we have good winches, good worn winches on all of our rigs. Why the hell would I want to use a high lift jack? I'd rather carry a come along than this damn thing if I need a backup winch. And people will argue, but you could break a bead off of a tire with the high lift jack, Desert Dog. It's like, you know what? We're running bead locks on all of our rigs these days. I have no need for that. So I really have no need for high lift jacks, and I suspect most off-roaders out there don't have a need for it anyways. It's just a big, heavy, cumbersome nuisance to pack on your rig, and there's way better uses of weight and space on your rig than a high lift jack. But once we got to the point where high lift jacks stopped working, we went to bottle jacks and, wondered why we ever carried a high lift jack in the first place. If you get the right bottle jack and accessories for it, you're going to fall in love with it. And I'll show you the bottle jack kit that I carry in our Jeeps and on my rock buggy. So I've been using one of these safe jacks now for probably the last 10 plus years, and this is my favorite jack kit now. I just loved it. Love it. And this is basically the jack you get. And yes, this jack is safe to lay down horizontally. A lot of the jacks you buy at Harbor Freight Tools aren't made to lay down. They have to remain in the vertical position. So it's a good quality jack, and comes with all these cool accessories. There's the handle tool. You can see it's even got a little bit of foam rubber on the end of it, so it's comfortable while you're jacking. But see, it's got all these bitchin' attachments to it. So you can adjust the height that you need. But that's pretty cool. Stays real secure in on your axle right there. And this is the lightest, easiest to package, and best solution for a trail jack I've ever used. I've seen welders get more seriously broken rigs off the trail than any other tool you can imagine. I've welded up mounts, brackets, tie rods, drag links, cross members, frames, engine mounts, drive lines, axle tubes, steering boxes, a shock hoop, and control arms. Welders just save trips, but they're expensive and you need to know how to weld to use one. Back in the day, all of us used to carry 6011 rods and use jumper cables with two batteries hooked in series to the rod. And those made really crappy trail repairs, but they did allow rigs to limp off the trail, and we limped a lot of them off the trail like that. Then I installed a Premier Power Welder in my YJ, and I liked it, but that has its limitations too. Then I carried a Ready Welder in my Jeep and buggy for the last 15 years, and that Ready Welder did over 25 trail repairs in our club, but I really hated pulling two batteries to use that thing. Hated that. I now use the self-contained Carnage Welder, and I'll do a review video on this welder next month, but it's a little bit heavier than I expected, but it really is the most convenient trail welder I've ever seen. And it puts down better quality welds than any other trail welding option I've also seen. On those multi-day remote trips, this thing's always going to be in my Jeep. But on those trailer trips to places like Johnson Valley or Moab or Sand Hollow, this will just be sitting in the tow rig, and if somebody needs a weld, I'll just run back and get it. So let me show you my tire repair kit, which has evolved drastically over the last year or so. In the old days, we all carried something like this to do trail repairs. And that's what we used. Probably my most classic trail repair was on Richard Goatman Gouthier. He got a real bad sidewall tear on one of his stickies, and you can see this has a stitching kit in it. We put 6 stitches and 45 plugs in there to get them off the trail. So where there's a will, there was a way. We would work our asses off to get rigs off the trail back then. We'd even use I'd carry a lot of spare plugs right there. We'd even use these fancy plug kits with cement. We'd break down the tire to put a patch on the inside and do all that, but we don't have to do that anymore. Those days are over now. Now we have 2 game changers. Game changer number 1, Colby valves. You break a valve stem stops working, gets ripped off on the trail, just rots and starts leaking. You could change it out with your tire still on the vehicle without breaking down the tire in 5 minutes. Colby valves, total game changer. The second game changer, glue tread. When I first saw this stuff advertised on social media, I was a real skeptic. I thought this stuff was just snake oil. And then I saw it get used a few times, and I'm actually impressed. This stuff works really good. I don't think I'll ever stitch up a tire again. So glue tread, man, game changer. Combination of glue tread, Colby valves. But remember, with the glue tread, you still need to prep the tire. So, I always carry a razor blade to cut patches to size and to trim things up. I always carry lots of sandpaper with me for prep. And of course, I showed you in my power tool section, I always bring that little Milwaukee portable die grinder, and I could put a wheel on that, and I can prep an area of the tire really fast to put a patch on it. So that's my tire repair kit. And before I conclude this video, I'm going to give you a solid piece of veteran advice here. The best thing you can do to deter problems on the trail is to do a thorough pre-trip inspection on your rig before you go. The last Trail Hero event, you know, I got under my buggy and went through everything, and I actually found a lot of stuff that would have been catastrophic failures on the trail if I didn't catch it in my garage before I left. For instance, you know, my front drive line, I found this cracked U-joint cap right there. I also had a big crack in my transmission mount, and I had to remove that and fabricate a new one before I went over there. Another tip I'll give you to make pre-trips easier, since I do so many of them, is I mark almost all of my bolts, especially the ones that need to be really tight, that I torque down. I mark them with a paint pen. That way I can visually inspect them and see if the bolts backed off. And that makes a pre-trip inspection actually pretty quick if you mark your bolts. So always do an adequate pre-trip inspection before you head out on the trail. As you've learned in this video, assembling a spare parts kit and tools isn't as easy as just throwing a bunch of random things in a box. Your parts and tools need to be specific to your rig. What good is having a spare axle shaft if you don't have the special socket to remove the spindle nut? What good is having a spare U-joint without having the tools to install it? You also need to know what commonly fails on your particular rig. If you have a Jeep TJ or XJ, especially with an auto trans, you better have a spare crank positioning sensor. If you have an old school Chevy TBI, you better have a spare ignition control module. If you have a new Bronco, you probably want to carry some spare tie rods with you. If you have that like 5-year span of Tacomas where they were losing crank position sensors, you probably want to have one for that. So tools and parts for rigs are rig specific, so keep that in mind. Well, I hope you found this video informative and entertaining. Don't forget to subscribe if you find my channel worthy of your subscription. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep the rubber side down.